What I would like to do now is as Peter said, introduce a climate hero. It's with great pleasure, and I feel deeply humbled to have Christiana Figueres here in the room with us today. I did not have hope after Copenhagen. I would have to say that after COP15, and the work that you have done, Ms. Figueres, has brought us to where we are today, where we have a lot of hope. And I think you can see from the science, which you know so well yourself, that the Arctic needs you, and certainly underscores so much of the work that you have done with the Paris Agreement. I would now like to turn over the stage to Christiana Figueres. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gail. And I think, as Peter has said, the Arctic needs all of us because it is very much of a collaborative process here. So I'd like to make 3 points today. The first is, and I'm sorry that I missed your presentation, but I can only imagine why Peter is on the verge of tears, because we all are. And what is happening on both sides, both extremities of the planet, is really just incredibly painful. So I would like to make 3 points today. One is what we have seen, what the science tells us. The only conclusion that we can reach from that is urgency. Urgency, urgency, urgency. And, mea culpa, because the Paris Agreement has no sense of urgency in it. It sets a direction. It, decides where do we start. Everybody decides where they start. Everybody sort of chooses their vehicle of engagement along this highway that we're going. And thank heavens we do have a final destination. But there is no sense of urgency, and I will tell you why. Because had we put the sense of urgency into the Paris Agreement, we would not have an agreement today. So it was a compromise that, in the last 24 hours, we had to look deep into our soul and say, do we put it in there because we know it would be killed? Or do we take it out and allow at least for a global framework to be there? So that was a very tough choice in the last 24 hours. That does not mean just because the Paris Agreement says that we have to rebalance emissions with absorption in the second half of the century. It should say, different preposition, by the second half of the century, by 2050. That's the power of words, right? One little preposition would put a sense of urgency into that text. But just because it doesn't say so in the Paris Agreement doesn't mean that that is the reality. And we see the evidence, right? In fact, we probably will be seeing even more and more of the urgency. So our way of understanding the urgency is that we need to get to the highest point of emissions, because we are still on that track, by 2020. Hello, wake-up call. I invite everybody to swallow the alarm clock. That is only 4 years from now. We need to get to the highest point of emissions and then begin our descent pretty quickly behind, right after that. And Johan Rockström, from whom you will hear today, has very helpfully already quantified that in saying we need to have our emissions, whether we are a corporation, an individual, a city, a country, whatever. Your guiding line here is half your emissions every decade until we get to a decarbonized economy by 2020. So that is the urgency. Now, is that possible? It is necessary. We know, we've heard the science. Is it advisable? Yes, because we have many benefits from that. Is it possible? Is it achievable? And I think that is where we hit up against a wall, because the achievability is not one that we're actually very convinced of. I would put it to you that the reason why we're not convinced of this achievability is because we're all locked in to our mental local maxima. We're all locked into that in our little head, right? We continue to convince ourselves we have done everything that we could, we can't go any farther. And we don't have this impetus to think outside of the box and go, wait. We have to completely change this. And that is the challenge that we have right now. We have to jump out of our local maxima right now and move into a very, very different approach. Why do I think this is possible? I think it's possible because we have many, many things that are working to our favor. The first, we have now 3 years, I'm an optimist, but did you know I was a stubborn optimist, right? No matter how much bad evidence there is out there, I always find reason for optimism. So here are my 6 reasons for optimism. A, we are into the 3rd year of flattened GHG emissions, while at the same time we have continued to grow GDP by at least 2 to 3% globally, which means we could begin to be seeing the decoupling of GDP from GHG that we have to see. Now, those who live in the north, most of you here, think that GDP does not have to continue to grow, we do not have to continue consumption, et cetera, et cetera. That may be true in the north. But I warn you that it is not true in the south, right? We do need to bring people out of poverty. We still have 1 billion people without food, without enough food, without enough clean water, without electricity, et cetera. So that needs to occur, but it cannot occur with the carbon footprint, hence that decoupling. But we already have 3 years of flattened GHG emissions globally with an increase in GDP. So, it begins to be possible. Second, technology. Fantastic how technology has increased its capacity and decreased its cost. 80% of solar costs has come down. We're investing incredibly into batteries. One of the reasons why Total has bought a large battery company, being an oil and gas company, is because they see that that is the future and that is becoming more and more economically feasible. In fact, in 30 countries already, renewable energy is already competitive with fossil fuels at a utility scale. So, certainly moving in there. And then to bring Peter's story into this, the broad participation, it is phenomenal. How many corporations, 90 corporations that have already taken on a 100% renewable energy commitment. We certainly didn't have that impetus just a couple of years ago. Google will be 100% renewable energy this year. So one of the best brands, best known brands around the world, really taking the lead and showing how this can be done. And thanks to Peter and so many other leaders there in the corporate sector, really taking on science-based target, frankly, not because they want to save the planet, but because there are no jobs, there are no clients, there is no profit to be done on a dead planet. So fortunately, we do have all of these imperatives that are actually helping each other out. And so the broad participation is very, very fundamentally very important because, in particular, given recent events, it is very clear that national governments are going to have a very, very difficult time with each other. So at that level, which was the cusp of what we did in Paris, the conversation and the agreement among national governments, that conversation is now going to be a very difficult conversation. Hence, it is very important to change the locus of action away from the political international conversation to where the action really takes place, to cities, to corporations, to investors, those who can really make the difference. And I do see that shift already occurring, and that is going to at least balance out, if not actually, hopefully take the forefront on what we're doing on climate, is going to shift to those sectors and to changing the reality. And that is the importance of having built toward Paris such a broad participation of stakeholders that it wasn't just the national governments, which is what we had in Copenhagen, because now we are reaping the benefits of having had that huge participation of stakeholders who will now take this forward no matter the consequences or no matter the aspirations of recent events. Fifth, resumed determination. I take such an inspiration because I see that, in particular after the U.S. election, I have seen such a upsurge of determination to not let that narrative be the controlling narrative of reality, but rather to prove that there is another reality that is more powerful and that has all of the impetus behind it. One small example, just 3 days after the US election, we had 47 developing countries, small, but developing countries, go forward and say, we're going to 100% renewables, which is even beyond what they had promised for Paris. And I see the same determination in the corporate sector. I see the same determination in the investor sector, and in all of the other actors in the financial world, because we must. And we cannot allow, for some narrative that would seek to put our efforts back to be the dominant narrative. So that resumed determination is actually quite exciting. And talk about resumed determination, right? Look who walks in the door. Hello, Al. I was just talking about resumed determination, and then you walk in. How's that for perfect timing? And finally, my sixth point that gives me a reason for being stubbornly optimistic is the incredible accumulation of idle capital that we have had, mostly as a result of the financial crisis of 2008. We now have an astonishing $2 trillion of idle capital sitting in the United States and $7 trillion in Asia. $7 trillion sitting there, not being used, mostly paying negative interest. And it is actually the equivalent of 40% of the regional GDP. So not only is it sitting there and available for the kinds of investment and infrastructure that we need to have, but it's actually, as idle capital, actually is a risk to the stability of the region, the economic stability. So we have to deal with that, and we have to be able to build the bridge between that idle capital, which is there with very, very difficult regulations, and the urgent investment needs that we need over the next 4 to 5 years. How do we bring those two? If you think of them as supply and demand, how do we bring those two together so that supply can meet the demand of investment? But the potential is there, right? So we have, just think, what good can we do on climate change and on clean infrastructure and clean energy if we were able to mobilize those $9 trillion that are available there? And I don't have the numbers for Europe, but that would only take it up. So 6 reasons to actually be stubbornly optimistic despite recent events, and to really understand my final vision that I would like to share with you is the following. Since I never graduated from kindergarten, I think in pictures. And here's my picture that I would like to share with you. I have lived for many, many years in front of a body of water because somehow my soul needs water. And this year I have chosen to move to London, and I live in front of the Thames River. For the first time, I'm living in front of a river that is tidal. That is a very, very different body of water and a very different river to a river such as the Rhine, where I used to live in Germany. Here's what I have learned from the Thames in the 3 weeks that I've been there. It is a tidal river. That means that you have high and low tides very visible in the Thames 2 times a day. And it means that twice a day you're at the lowest point in the tide, and twice a day you're at the highest point in the tide. We're at a very low tide right now on what we want to do on climate change. But here's the lesson from the Thames. The high and the low tides do not change the direction of the flow of the river. So whether you're experiencing a low tide or a high tide, and those will always be there because politics is a part of our lives, right? Whether you're experiencing a high or a low, and right now we're experiencing a low some places and a high other places, but the direction of travel is not changed. We are incontrovertibly and irreversibly moving toward a decarbonized society, no matter what the politics, no matter what the elections. And the high and the low tides do not change the direction of the flow of the water. So take heart in that. Understand that this is not the first time that we have a low tide. We will have it 2 times a day in our human experience, but we'll also have a high tide 2 times a day in our human experience. And the important thing is that we continue to feed the river of progress in the direction that we have to go with all of your help. Thank you.